So hey guys, it's Zion again, and welcome to episode 2 of Final Fantasy's Failures. Today we're covering Final Fantasy VIII. I know I just did 6, but I'm saving 7 for last, because, well, it's my favorite and I don't want to bash it too much. But this is one of the first games I had played on Aftermath, and it was with Culprit and some of the guys. And it's Conquest, not Scavenger, so there's a lot more to this map. And I'm using the 8K. I started out with the laser sight, but switched it up to suppressor. Skulls and Spades had been having amazing luck with the suppressor on these maps, and so I thought I'd give it a try. He was using the AUG silenced, which is a monster, but the AEK is one of my favorite guns in this game, and always has been, so I'd use this. When it comes to Final Fantasy VIII, the closest comparison I can draw between Final Fantasy games I've played is between 8 and 13, really. Because much like with 13, they really changed up how the game flowed in Final Fantasy VIII. The battle system was the same. There were still limit breaks. There was still a world map. There was still an airship to run around in the world map in. In fact, there were 2 of them. One of which had one of the coolest opening sequences I've ever seen, and the other was basically just a dragon you flew inside of, which was awesome. And I thought the lore was really cool, that there was these sorceresses and this young woman with the ability to send consciousnesses back into the past. Unfathomable links back or forward. But one of the core things they changed was the magic system. In most Final Fantasy games to that point, indeed all of them, magic was an unlimited resource so long as you had the magic points to cast it. The same logic here goes for Ford's Model T. You could have it in any color, so long as it was black. And while Final Fantasy VII did change magic up a little bit, as did 6, and I imagine 5 and 4 had somewhat different systems, with Final Fantasy VIII, they had the junction system, which could greatly change how a character fared in battle. You could use magic that you drew from enemies to help them avoid poisoning, or avoid being petrified, or they could absorb lightning and gain health when an enemy uses lightning magic on them, and so forth. And then there was the draw system, which meant you had a finite number of spells to cast. So if you wanted to cast fire, for example, and you had drawn 25 fire spells, you could cast 25 versions of fire, and then you were out of that spell. You had to draw it from either a draw point or more enemies, or craft it from a whole number of different things, which I may get into later. And for some reason, for me at the very least, that change was too much. Because the magic system is a subsystem in Final Fantasy. It's not meant to, at least in my mind, it's not meant to change a core gameplay. And when you have an ability to use the most powerful spells in the game, but you have also tied those spells to a statistic, and that statistic is reduced when you use those, it gets really convoluted and overcomplicated. And it made players think differently. And I'm sure there are tons of people who liked the different thinking that the magic system brought them. But for me, it was too drastic. If they had kept the MP points and somehow worked in the junctioning system, then I think that would be better. I liked that you could junction the summons in the game, that they were no longer available to all characters at all times so long as they had the proper equipment. But the junctioning system itself, I think, was too much. Final Fantasy is a role-playing game, and yes, there's a lot of statistical thought that goes into a role-playing game. But junctioning, for me, made Final Fantasy VIII a numbers game. It didn't make it a role-playing game. You spent a good portion of your time saying, alright, so do I use all my lightning 3, I don't know if that's not what it is, to absorb the lightning for this next boss, or do I use Ultima to subtract 50% from all elements? And when I look at the strategy guide for that game and some of the boss strategies they put together, It's just, okay, so you want to go to this island and stock up on this spell and junction it and never use it in the battle. No. I want the freedom to use whatever the hell kind of spells I want whenever I want to use them. I mean, even Final Fantasy XIII, for all its flaws, had a magic system that, okay, you have some magic, you don't have all the magic, but you have some, and you can use it as much as you like with no penalty to your character or to any of the time spent in-game. Final Fantasy VIII didn't have that. Instead, they had the junction system, which I've just belabored into oblivion. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, and not because I've said it, because everybody said it. The main character, Squall, not only is he depressing, he's unnecessarily depressing. And he's depressed enough that he's aware of it. He is perfectly aware of the fact that he is one of the most boring beings in the game. And we've come to understand that he's a victim of abandonment and the inability to know who his father is, and he's constantly searching for himself. But the same could be said for Tidus. I mean, he built a life for himself without ever really liking or knowing his father. Zidane didn't know his parents, and he turned out just fine. Squall was written to be this emo kid that nothing could make happy. And even when the romance with Rinoa is starting to take off at the end of Disc 2, he realizes that the entire team is trying to set the two of them up, he does not want that to happen. He doesn't want it to happen so hard that he goes into this deep depression. He comes out of it as the Disc 3 progresses and he becomes more familiar with Rinoa and more comfortable around her. And one of the most touching scenes in that game, for me, was when he's carrying her on the train tracks, just alone with his thoughts and the woman he loves. And it's at that moment where he's neither happy nor sad. He simply is existing. He's not emotionally attached to anything. He's just walking and thinking. But there's a sense of positivity to him. There's almost hope that he hadn't had to that point. Because he never has hope. In most of the first two discs, it's always just, whatever. This is stupid. Everything is bad. And that, as a character, is not a good trait. When there is no redeeming positive quality to their attitude, which Squall didn't have for most of the first half of the game, it becomes a grind to hear that character talk. Final Fantasy XIII had a reverse of that with Vanille. She was so uppity and so happy all the time that I couldn't keep playing because she was so annoying. Snow was so, yeah, Daddy, I hit everything all the time, and no, that was Hope. Snow was, I'm the hero all the time. They were stereotypes. And Squall, for me, was the first stereotype Final Fantasy character. And they shouldn't be. Talk a little bit about 7 here. Cloud, yeah, he was pretty dour. He was pretty down on himself. He had these very positive, funny moments. He was a rounded character. Even from the start, you could tell there was something else behind it. With Squall, it's just he's constantly... Even his in-game model has a frown on his face. If you're going to worry so much about the emotions your characters are expressing, A, there should be more than one. And B, their face should change. Now, I know the PlayStation 1 couldn't do that very well. But really, characters are what make stories. And if your characters suck, your story sucks. Final Fantasy VIII eventually got around to making good characters. But it took a little too long.